If you had told me 10 years ago that my life would become a slow-motion train wreck fueled by my own blood, I would have laughed. I mean, how could the apple fall so far from the tree that it lands in a pile of flaming garbage? But here we are. My name is Mark. I'm 45 years old, living in the Midwest, a place where dreams go to die quietly and lawyers rule like petty kings. At least, that's what my father drilled into me since I was old enough to form sentences. Dad was a man carved from stone, the kind who believed emotions were weaknesses and success was measured by the size of your bank account and the prestige of your job. Naturally, he was a lawyer, a big-shot one, the kind whose name was on the door and whose voice could shut down a courtroom faster than a judge banging the gavel. From the moment my son Jake told me he wanted to be an artist, my world twisted into a grotesque carnival ride I never asked to board. An artist? Dad spat through clenched teeth when I told him. That's a fancy way to say loser. You have to understand, my dad didn't just disapprove. He humiliated. At every family gathering, every casual dinner, he made sure to remind me that my son was squandering the family legacy. I was a disappointment, a failure, and Jake, a damn disgrace. Of course, I told myself I'd stand up for Jake. After all, he's my son. But try standing up to a man who never let you forget. He put you through college and gave you everything. I was a puppet, and my strings were fraying fast. The day Jake announced he got accepted into a prestigious art school, I thought I'd finally reached some peace with my father. I was wrong. Dad invited himself over for dinner, the kind of surprise visit that felt more like a raid. When Jake proudly showed his acceptance letter, Dad sneered like he'd just tasted spoiled milk. "You're throwing your life away on finger paintings," he said loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I felt my face burn. I opened my mouth to defend Jake, but the words caught somewhere between my throat and the floor. Jake? He just smiled, like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "Better to paint than to sell out," he said softly. That line haunted me for weeks. I kept replaying that dinner in my head, the way Dad looked at me like I was a disappointment carved into human form. The way Jake held his head high, refusing to shrink into the shadows. I wanted to scream. I wanted to protect my son, but all I did was swallow my pride, nod politely, and pretend nothing had happened. The worst part? Dad wasn't wrong to judge me for being weak. I was a coward, letting the man who made me feel small continue to tear down my family. And Jake? He was the only light in this pit of bitterness. Since that night, things between me and Dad have been colder than a Minnesota winter. He's made it clear that unless Jake dumps his artistic nonsense and follows the law, I'm on my own. So here I am, caught between a rock and a very stubborn kid who refuses to be anyone's pawn. And Dad, well, he's sharpening his knives for the next attack. But I'm no longer sure how much longer I can take it. For Jake's sake, and maybe for my own. Because some battles aren't fought with lawyers or lawsuits. Sometimes they're fought with silence, patience, and a little bit of revenge. After that explosive dinner, the tension in my family settled into a kind of thick fog. You know the kind, where every word feels like stepping on thin ice, and everyone's waiting for the whole thing to crack and drown them. Dad doubled down on his insults. At family events, he wouldn't talk to Jake directly, but found every chance to jab at me. When will you realize that lawyers build legacies? Artists build nothing but castles in the air. I wanted to scream back, but it was like arguing with a statue that just stared at you coldly, unmoved by logic or feelings. The worst part was watching Jake take it all with that weird, infuriating calm. He wasn't a kid anymore. He was a man who knew exactly who he was, no matter what a bitter old man thought. Jake's art began to gain attention, Not the big gallery famous type, but enough to ruffle some feathers in our small town. His paintings, raw and honest, started showing up in local exhibitions. I saw something in him I hadn't seen in years. Courage. Meanwhile, I was stuck in my job as a mid-level manager at a firm my dad's influence helped me get into. The office was a cage of polite smiles and quiet competition. Sometimes I wondered if my father ever thought about how different my life could have been if I had the guts to stand up for my own choices instead of his. One evening, after a particularly brutal phone call where Dad told me I was throwing my family's future away on dreams, I found Jake in the garage, covered in paint, humming some song I didn't recognize. He looked up and grinned. "You okay, Dad?" Forced a smile. "I will be." Jake sighed. "You know, he'll never get it. But maybe that's his problem, not ours." Those words felt like a light in a tunnel I'd been crawling through for years. For once, I didn't feel so alone. But the silence between me and Dad was deafening. Then came the day I realized that silence could be the most powerful weapon of all. Dad's arrogance was his weakness. At a recent family reunion, a tense event, where Dad tried to flaunt his success and remind everyone of his superior status, I noticed something unusual. Dad's old law firm was suddenly the center of a scandal. Rumors of mismanaged funds, unethical deals, and possible lawsuits began to swirl. The man who preached justice and integrity might be losing his own. I kept this news to myself. For now. Meanwhile, Jake's art was finally getting some real recognition. An art collector from New York reached out, wanting to buy several of his pieces. This was the kind of break that could change everything. One night after a quiet dinner, Jake looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see straight through my worries. "Dad, maybe it's time you stop living for him," he said. I smiled, feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could rewrite our story. Not the one Dad wanted, but the one we deserved. So I started planning. I wouldn't let Dad's humiliations define me anymore. I wouldn't let his shadow darken my son's light. I was going to show him that the real legacy isn't built on money or power. It's built on courage, love, and maybe a little bit of revenge. Because sometimes the best victories come from the quietest battles. And this one was just beginning. The day I decided to take action was the day I finally stopped being Dad's punching bag. Funny how it took me decades to figure out that silence wasn't weakness, it was ammunition. Dad was sitting at his usual place in the country club, chest puffed up like a peacock who just found a new mirror. The man still thought he owned the world and me. But this time, I had a plan. See, when you grow up under the shadow of someone who humiliated you for years, you learn how to play the long game. Dad's law firm scandal? That was just the tip of the iceberg. Months earlier, I had quietly gathered evidence. Emails, financial documents, witness statements, all pointing to my father's perfect legacy crumbling under fraud and lies. I hired a private investigator. I networked with some of the people Dad had burned over the years. Everyone had a grudge. On top of that, Jake's art career was taking off like a rocket. He was now featured in a well-known New York gallery, getting rave reviews. I couldn't help but beam with pride every time his name appeared in the news. So, one evening, I invited Dad over under the guise of a truce. I served his favorite steak and poured him a glass of his expensive whiskey, the one he bragged about at every opportunity. He smirked, convinced this was just another opportunity to humiliate me again. How wrong he was. I slid a thick envelope across the table. "This," I said, voice calm but sharp, "is everything you've been hiding. All the lies, the scams, the backdoor deals." Dad's smirk faltered. His eyes flicked over the documents, panic slowly creeping in. "You don't know what you're doing," he barked, but his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," I said. "And I'm giving you a choice. Come clean, or I take this to the authorities and the media." For the first time in years, Dad was speechless, the mighty man reduced to a trembling mess. But the real victory wasn't in seeing him squirm, it was in watching Jake's name rise while Dad's empire crumbled. Weeks later, the scandal exploded. The news spread like wildfire. Dad's firm lost clients overnight. His reputation was shredded. Meanwhile, Jake's art sold for record prices. Galleries clamored for his work. His shows were packed with people eager to celebrate his talent. Watched all this unfold, a quiet smile playing on my lips. Dad tried to reach out, to apologize, to make amends. But I was done playing his game. "You had your chance," I told him once. "Now I'm building my own legacy, one that doesn't need your approval." "Jake?" He hugged me tight after his biggest exhibition, whispering, "You saved us." "No, Jake, you saved me. And as for Dad, well, let's just say karma has a way of serving cold justice.